Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast, recorded on stage at CDMO Live Europe 2026 in Rotterdam. This episode is sponsored by PharmaBlock, a fully integrated CRDMO providing research, development and manufacturing services from early discovery to commercial production.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I am Gil Roth. I'm the president of the Pharma Biopharma Outsourcing Association, a trade group that represents CMOs and CDMOs. So I founded the group in 2014. I'll give you a brief introduction here before we get into the craziness of my topic. Founded the trade association in 2014 to really advocate for CDMOs in front of FDA, Congress, and other government agencies in the US and elsewhere. Basically, we tackle regulatory and legislative issues for CDMOs, but also try to work to bring CDMOs together through a number of working groups, conferences, and other meetings that we have to sort of give you guys who are CDMOs, a safe space, a place that is antitrust compliant, but one where CDMOs can actually share best practices, ask questions, discuss, we have a quality technical group, an AI and machine learning working group, and other working groups that really allow CDMOs to share expertise and learn from each other. You can see our member list up there. The sustaining members who are part of my board of trustees are in bold. So I got some topics. There's a lot going on in US policy and other countries' policies that are impacting pharma, CDMOs, patient access, and the like. Going to try and tackle as much as I can. I have 40 minutes, but there's a timer saying 20 minutes here. I'm going to ignore that and do the full 40 if I can. Probably won't have time for questions, but please grab me at any time on the show floor. I'll be here today through tomorrow. But among the major topics, trade war, tariffs, and most favored nation pricing form a key area we're going to discuss as a sort of matrix of topics. Those lead into supply chain, America first, onshoring and reshoring issues. Beyond that, there's an awful lot going on at FDA right now that I need to kind of talk through with you guys to kind of share with you what I've learned from interactions with the agency in the past year, how they've responded and reacted after the mass firings that took place April of last year, and how they're trying to rebuild what they have. And I will give a sort of conclusion statement, but really the spoiler for that is, as you guys all know, things are very uncertain. Things I tell you now might be out of date by the time I finish the presentation. The key is for both pharma and for the clients and the CDMO side to be prepared, to try to retain some flexibility, to try to handle the uncertainty as best you can without overcommitting on certain types of expenditures or creating a lack of flexibility. So, trade wars and tariffs. Last year when I spoke at this event, we were about a month into the Liberation Day tariffs, during which the president used an unprecedented authority to try to levy tariffs on a country-by-country basis with the idea that trade deficits constituted a national security threat. The Supreme Court struck that down late last year, and basically the administration is now processing refund requests for $160 billion worth of tariffs collected by US companies who were importing goods during that span. This president believes that tariffs will help serve a goal of trying to incentivize and lead to more domestic manufacturing in a variety of different areas. What we care about is pharma. So, in lieu of the IEEPA, or Liberation Day tariffs that got struck down, the administration began something called a Section 232 probe of the pharma supply chain. This is a tariff regime with a precedent, so one that he can actually do. It involves investigating different industrial sectors to see about their national security threats and how best to resolve them. At this show last year, I was finalizing PBOA's statement to the Department of Commerce about this Section 232 probe and where we saw issues in terms of pharma supply chains I will give, once again, a kind of spoiler here if you haven't read our document on this. We are not for tariffs. We are against tariffs from a CDMO perspective. We gave a number of regulatory, financial, and tax code ideas to the Department of Commerce to talk about incentivizing domestic U.S. manufacturing, but really pushed away from the idea of using tariffs to try to achieve that. Another spoiler, they didn't listen. The Department of Commerce put out a set of tariffs about a month ago imposed on all pharma companies or all pharma products coming into the U.S., as well as ingredients and a number of other components that are used in pharma. Tell me if I'm going too fast. Is this too much? There's a lot of things I got to go over today. You guys keeping up? Okay, that's good. I got some thumbs up over there. So yeah, there is a new pharmaceutical tariff regime that will go into effect late September. It involves a 100% tariff on pharma goods and other products coming into the U.S. from countries that have not signed a new trade agreement with the U.S. during that Liberation Day phase. The EU is covered, Japan, South Korea, the UK, and a few other regions have made agreements. They are capped at 15% tariffs for any of those products coming in. They can also get to zero for certain classes of products, orphan drugs, antibody drug conjugates, and a few others. For anyone who's importing from other countries not listed there, and that would include India and China, there are a couple of things you can do as a pharma company to try to reduce your tariff burden. This impacts the CDMO space because the first necessary trigger to do that is to have some sort of onshoring initiative in the U.S. This gets you to 20% tariff instead of 100%. Negotiating a most favored nation pricing agreement after that gets you down to 0%, but the onshoring thing is that first step. With PBOA, we spoke to the Department of Commerce on multiple occasions as this was being developed to make sure they understood the role that CDMOs play and the necessity of, if you are trying to count onshoring as a reason to strike down tariffs, then you should count use of domestic CDMOs as part of that. It can be a little challenging, as some of you know, to explain to people what CDMOs do, the role we play, et cetera. But what we really tried to get across was the US president sent letters to the 17 largest pharma companies about how to lower prices, do more domestic manufacturing, and to raise prices elsewhere in the world so that money could be repatriated to the US. We tried to explain, once those 17 companies had made their agreements, there are 1,700 more, if not more than that don't have the capacity to make these sorts of arrangements, don't have the capacity to build in the US. And we really got across to the Department of Commerce the importance of including CMOs as part of the onshoring criteria that they developed. About a week or so ago, they put out a Federal Register notice about how to prove that you are onshoring and then how to satisfy the next MFN trigger for lowering tariffs. It did include contract manufacturers. It is insanely convoluted and complex as to what companies will have to report to the Department of Commerce about their onshoring, but at least there's something there that recognizes tech transfer to a US CMO means you're trying to get products into the US. We don't endorse it. I'm just explaining what some of the issues are and how CMOs are intended to be treated within that framework. Like I said, there are a lot of exemptions within this agreement that probably will keep a lot of pharma products from being overcharged as far as that goes. That said, one of the big issues we brought up with Commerce is what happens when the CMO is the importer of record and not the market authorization holder for a drug? What happens when the CMO is buying bulk products and various other components and consumables intended to manufacture products domestically in the US? They do not have an onshoring agreement, and there's no ability of a CMO to make a most favored nation pricing agreement, so we're hit with 100% tariffs going forward if we are buying as importers of record. Commerce understood our problem. Their take was, if you're importing for a customer that has a 0% tariff, just mention that that's who it is, and you'll get zero. The problem is, as CMOs here know, when you're buying those sorts of things as the importer of record, you're buying in bulk for many different customers, some of whom might be 0%, 100%, 20%, 15%. Commerce understood that this could be a problem going forward and is hoping that we will be able to provide more paper on this and explain to them so they can figure out some way of not hamstringing CMOs who are just trying to support as many customers and ultimately patients as they can. The other big aspect, as I mentioned, besides onshoring when it comes to these tariffs, is most favored nation pricing, where the U.S. is trying to pressure drug companies into lowering their prices to match reference pricing in a basically basket of other countries that have price negotiations between their governments and drug companies. This isn't a direct CMO thing. Whenever I meet with congressional offices, the first thing I tell them is, my members have nothing to do with drug pricing. Please don't call me into a hearing on this stuff. We just make the drugs for the companies. So as far as MFN goes, we don't have a direct hit from this. However, you can game out a scenario, which we talked about in a podcast recording earlier this morning, where some pharma companies may choose not to launch certain drugs in certain regions for fear that a lower price there could lead to a forced lower price in the US. That hurts patients first and foremost, but it hurts CMOs in terms of changing the volumes and the markets in which they were going to manufacture for a customer. So we're keeping an eye on MFN and how that's going to be implemented going forward and what the CMO impact of that's going to be. As a side note, before the MFN pricing in the previous administration, we had something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which I realize I should not abbreviate as IRA for some people, which also has it gives Medicare in the US the ability to negotiate certain drug prices depending on expenditure levels and patient sizes. There are exceptions there are rules within that may incentivize certain types of R&D. Small molecule gets, it has a shorter timeline before their drugs can be negotiated compared to large. That might lead to certain drug pipelines being culled, cultivated, et cetera, in order to get the longest degree of price control that a drug company gets under the IRA. Also, with the IRA, your timeline for when you are subject to these negotiations begins with the first approval. And one of the impacts of that can be, unlike historic situations where pharma might pursue a smaller patient population to just bring a drug to market initially and then widen out with bigger clinical trials in other areas, they may go for that big clinical trial from the outset and try and get as big a market as they can from the beginning, potentially not pursuing those smaller trials and smaller patient populations. That can have some effect for CMOs who are supporting these sorts of trials, as well as quicker launches than may have been expected depending on how those trials go. This is a graphic that CDMO Live has included for me, just showing how innovator drug prices can be a little out of control in the US. So there are issues when it comes to reimbursement and drug pricing where it does make sense to try to find some degree of parity. However, a lot of the heavy-handed policies that have currently been initiated could cause real problems, as I said, when it comes to patient access and choices of where to launch. Then there's supply chains and the America First policies that the current administration is pursuing. From COVID onwards, we have been reevaluating supply chains. A lot of drug products, a lot of countries have seen a sense of reevaluation as to where things should be manufactured, trying to get more transparency as to what the manufacturing base looks like. There are regions when COVID vaccines were first rolling out where countries realized they did not have manufacturing capacity and therefore had to sort of get online with the other countries that weren't as advanced as certain ones that have significant mRNA and other vaccine manufacturing. So we've seen this attempt at de-risking supply chains, and what that starts to look like is regionalization, in country for country or in region for region. We know from a manufacturing perspective that's not efficient, and that can cause more supply chain fragility rather than robustness and resilience. And so we've tried working to explain to various governmental bodies about some of the limitations of that idea of regionalization, how some CMOs can support this, but you're still better off having a much broader supply chain with sort of bigger nodes as they are, with the idea that black swan events can occur. COVID, giant ship getting stuck in the Suez, the Strait of Hormuz getting closed for reasons, which I'll get to. But trying to figure out ways of making sure supply chains are more transparent than they have been, while also preserving the globalized aspects of manufacturing that have made pharma a worldwide, has enabled us to support patients worldwide, even with smaller, we'll say domestic or in-country facilities. But the tariff threats are intended to promote onshoring, and that has been a questionable goal. We'll talk a little about what some of the responses have been by pharma companies and CMOs to the U.S. government's push towards these things. The U.S. is not the only country trying to push for onshoring. I always say every country has a shore. We know that the EU has been working very seriously on a Critical Medicine Supply Act, as well as other legislation to try to promote domestic manufacturing and access. Part of our goal is making sure CMOs are always seen as part of the solution for that these are not just in-house pharma for pharma. Part of the governmental threats the U.S. has initiated as far as tariffs go, particularly during the Liberation Day phase, was also to push for foreign direct investment in the U.S. Certain countries announced astronomical figures that would be spent in America for manufacturing and other needs. We're seeing some of that impact on the CDMO side, which I'll show you in a slide or so. But the last bullet point I have here about supply chains is it is an all-of-government effort. And in some cases involving the FDA, for example, we just finished negotiating one of the 5-year user fee agreements. In this case, the generic drug user fees. Other significant ones are also being negotiated right now. The FDA proposed a number of America First concepts during negotiation, some of which were palatable, other ones were not feasible or otherwise would have defeated the purpose they were trying to achieve. And we negotiated through those because that's what a negotiation is. So when I talk about the U.S. investment and onshoring, this is a not up-to-date list, because things are always changing, of announcements by in-house pharma of investments they're making in the U.S. since this administration began. The very first one was Lilly announcing a $50 billion investment before saying, well, $23 billion was already committed, but we're doing $27 billion more for 4 facilities. And then J&J came out with their $55 billion, and it turned into a numbers game where Pfizer came out at $70 billion. Merck is also at 70. Other companies announced significant investments. The key thing to understand about this is the first 1 or 2, Lilly and J&J, for example, were specifically about CapEx for new operations. After that, other companies started making announcements of titanic numbers, but they started including R&D spend, operations, updating facilities, things that were maybe either already committed or things that they're doing as part of their ongoing business, but saying that that was part of their onshoring agreement, or onshoring investment. So a few of these companies, Regeneron was the first one to do it, they had made an initial announcement that solely consisted of their agreement with Fujifilm Diosynth for CDMO operation. Not to build anything new, but simply an agreement with them. Sanofi was another one. They announced $20 billion domestic investment, but the press release including work with our domestic manufacturing partners. So everything got lumped in to try to satisfy the big billion figure that needed to be announced. Some of these are breaking ground, they're underway. The president threatened everybody last September that if they don't break ground in the next 30 days, they're going to face a 100% tariff on everything. That kind of went away quickly. But nonetheless, we're seeing significant announcements of domestic investment in the U.S. by a lot of pharma companies. We also saw a bunch from CDMOs. And the thing I explained to the Department of Commerce when I showed them this graphic is that previous chart has Bs. There are a lot of billions in there. The CDMO chart, a lot of Ms. A lot of millions in there. Thermo Fisher is an exception, but the $2 billion they announced includes CDMO, but is also includes other Thermo Fisher operations in the US. Everyone else there is spending in the millions. My argument, and what I try to convey to Commerce and every other agency that we talk to, is we may not be making a gigantic facility for $5 billion to make a single API, but what we do is a force multiplier. What CDMOs do benefits so many different companies and ultimately patients. This needs to be recognized. This is never going to be in the billions. CDMOs don't have that sort of revenue and that ability to justify an investment that large, given a lot of the structural issues around when we recognize revenue, what markets look like, what timelines are like for building. But one of the interesting things about this chart, there are a couple of companies there. This is actually incomplete because after I sent this in, Bora announced a $125 million acquisition of a U.S. facility from Macrogenics. They're already in the U.S., but that CMO is adding further capacity in the U.S. One of the things, if you look at Rovi and Samsung Biologics over on the right side, those were non-U.S. CMOs buying into the U.S. to expand to build a U.S. footprint. And that's something we were anticipating in this administration as we saw the tariffs getting levied, whether some non-U.S. CMOs would begin looking at U.S. operations as a hedge at a minimum to make sure they could say, we're here too, we're not just a non-U.S. CMO, we should be seen as somebody making an investment here. So with the previous slide also, there's a Celltrion announcement for $500 million. They bought a Lilly facility. They were going to do that both in-house, use that facility for in-house and CMO. So I included it as in-house, but that's a similar one where a company from outside U.S. tried to build its first U.S. footprint, all in the past year plus. So there is movement in that direction. It is a factor hitting the CMO space that some non-U.S. companies are at least deciding whether to build a U.S. footprint or to acquire. In Rovi's case, I believe it was a Bristol-Myers Squibb facility. Samsung bought the former Human Genome Sciences, which I think was GSK, to build their U.S. steps. But that's a lot. The CDMO Live guys gave me this one too. You can get my slides after the fact, but they kind of want to break down CDMOs by category and just how darn many of us there are. But like I say, about that U.S. investment, the big questions were how much is CapEx and how much is stuff you are already doing being counted as part of your investment and onshoring initiative. Actually, the question mark for do CDMOs count should now be an exclamation point. As I mentioned, the Department of Commerce put out their onshoring criteria. They do count CMOs as part of this world. So that we do tech transfer to a domestic CMO is seen as investment, it's seen as onshoring, it does provide some sort of tariff relief if you can prove that you're moving a product there and trying to get things manufactured here as quick as you can. The big issue about all this investment, though, several of the big issues, if those major pharma announcements I mentioned are actually going to come to fruition, that's a lot of building. That's a lot of equipment that needs to be imported under various degrees of tariffs because equipment, steel, aluminum, and everything else are still getting hit. But there's a lot of equipment that has, as we all know, longer timelines. It's all going to come to the U.S. and it's all going to need validation, qualification, et cetera, and ultimately is going to need FDA to clear manufacturing and to approve these sites and to approve the new lines. This is going to be a bottleneck. If everybody with $30, $40, $50 billion investments is spending that money at the same time, someone's going to come up short. You guys on the CMO side are going to come up short because you will not get to the front of the line when it comes to specific manufacturing equipment and operational lines that somebody else is willing to pay a lot more for. We saw this with serialization back in 2015 and 16 when the major pharmas all got ahead of the line for all the track and trace equipment and machinery and training. We'll see it again if this stuff actually comes through over the next 3 years and beyond. In addition, there are workforce constraints tied to all this where if you actually built all this stuff, there is not enough workforce in the U.S. to handle it all. U.S. immigration policies are going to further constrain the ability of those companies to staff these sites. And that may mean essentially pharma companies poaching pharmaceutical staff from CMOs in order to work at some of these facilities. The upshot is these facilities may get built and never used, or might get used a little bit and never used again. We've seen historically major pharma companies build sites in regions, get them fully operational, and never actually turn on the lights, sell all the equipment through an equipment vendor, and take a write-off for whatever R&D was going to take place there because markets changed, R&D failure happened, whatever it was. Last year, after CPHI, Endpoints had an article where the CEO of Recipharm was quoted as saying, in terms of whether all these investments will be a challenge or opportunity for CMOs, he said, within 10 years, 75% of these sites will be up for sale. So CMOs are probably going to benefit from that. I was happy because I'd sort of been saying that on the side, and I was glad that someone in an official capacity put that out there. I think it'll be shorter than 10 years, I'll put it that way. But these facilities, if they do end up getting built and coming to fruition, could potentially become CMO assets down the line. So we will see what shape that takes. So there's a lot of other America First policies out there. We've seen several executive orders from this administration that are intended to push for domestic manufacturing, intended to make facility construction and development work more smoothly with FDA. There's also a strategic API reserve that's being discussed that could lead to, a little more domestic manufacturing, but probably won't. The big thing that I talked about last year that finally did get completed is the BioSecure Act, which is intended to provide a list of China-based companies that are considered companies of concern because of their relationship with the Chinese military, and to bar companies that receive certain U.S. grants, loans, and other projects and contracts from working with those companies. This was first supposed to be done in 2024, fell apart at the last minute. In 2025, a weaker version of it was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. We consulted a little after the fact when the legislation was put together just to provide some information to Congress on what the U.S. and non-U.S. CDMO landscape was like, what things could move from China to other CDMOs, and what those timelines might look like. Again, I'll repeat, we were not involved in the development of this legislation. We were called in after the fact as experts to clarify whether the timelines they put in and requirements actually made sense. With this new version, there is a trigger. In the original 2024 version that did not pass, individual companies were named, and then further companies could be added. With the 2025 version that was passed, no companies were named. Instead, there's a Department of Defense list that comes out every year, the 1260H, that lists companies of concern that have these relationships with Chinese military, and BioSecure would take any biopharma companies from that list and apply that to BioSecure. That list historically has come out in January or February of every year, and it was delayed a bit this time around. The Federal Register notice came out in early February for this list. It had a PDF, I think 30 or 40 pages, listing all the companies that were now on the 1260H list. I downloaded it right away, going through, seeing it. Wuxi AppTech was listed, but other major Chinese CDMOs were not. And then the 1260H list was withdrawn, and the Federal Register notice maybe 15 to 20 minutes after it went live. I had sent out the link to all my members, and they were saying, Gil, you sent the wrong link. We're clicking and nothing's showing up. I said, well, here's the list. I downloaded it, and then I went back to the Federal Register and noticed it had been withdrawn. It has not been reissued, which means any BioSecure action moving forward is still contingent on that list being issued and actually being acted upon by Congress. My assumption was the administration was going to wait until after the recent summit with the Chinese premier and U.S. president. We'll see what comes after that. Bloomberg recently put out an article about this debacle that meant it had nothing to do with pharma. It was more tech companies on the China side that were named in that list that maybe should not have been named, but it wasn't vetted correctly. And Went up too early and now has been withdrawn. I still have that PDF if anybody wants to see it. I've saved that for posterity's sake. But that means BioSecure is in a holding pattern. There'll be a 5-year period from the time that companies are named on that list and acted upon by Congress that companies would then have to decouple from them. But that's in limbo. All the work and preparation CDMOs have done and that their clients have done in preparing for potential change has to wait on this administration and this Congress, which, as we've talked about from the beginning, could be a little unpredictable. User fees are another major area that America First policies are being implemented in. As I had said, we negotiate these user fee agreements between industry and FDA every 5 years, and I'll talk a little further about that down the line. But like I said, administration tried to figure out different levers. One of the China ones on the PDUFA side, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which is the innovators, NDAs and BLAs, one of the proposals, and this is from the public minutes, I'm not giving away anything proprietary, one of the proposals was to increase your NDA or BLA filing fee if you used phase 1 data from China, and to charge your company every year if your drug came with that basis, if it had that sort of clinical data attached to it. Industry pushed back very hard on this. Ultimately, I think where they landed based on the public minutes was a reduction in filing fees if your clinical data for phase 1 is coming solely from the US. So carrot instead of stick. That's been a ongoing thread with the administration and industry in terms of, do you look for incentives or do you look for penalties? As CMOs, we have to work with our clients on these things and try to provide them with options, figuring out how to go forward and how to make sure that you're not just supplying the US market necessarily, but other ones beyond that. I'm going to skip the executive orders that came through. There'll be slides for these, and you can download all that stuff after the fact. I mentioned these 3 executive orders previously. Domestic manufacturing one came out while I was on the flight here last year. That plays into the GDUFA stuff, or generic drug user fee stuff I'll talk about shortly. FDA is going to try and work with companies as they're building facilities in the US to make sure they are FDA compliant and have strong quality systems from the outset instead of building in a vacuum and then bringing FDA in to inspect. And allegedly there'll be a strategic API reserve if there's money for it and if the APIs come from the US, but again, non-starter. BioSecure I've already gone through. I had my slides in a completely wrong sequence, my bad. I will say, in addition to BioSecure, the US Congress recently put out not a bill, but something to instruct FDA not to accept drug applications that have all their clinical data coming from China. It's not binding, but it's a sign that Congress is trying to pursue a China decoupling arrangement. And again, what that's going to mean for US companies and CDMOs that are working with clients who have this sort of R&D chain is up for debate, up for question, certainly. With PBOA, we work with the State Department as they've tried to find not just how to move drugs out of Chinese CDMOs towards the US, but how to get other countries that are working with Chinese CDMOs to find other regions in which to outsource. So the government is looking at CDMOs and CROs as potential ways of creating, we'll say, alternate supply chains and alternate R&D chains moving forward. Of course, China can respond to all these things. Their initial rare earths response last year has significantly changed the equation geopolitically when it comes to US-China relations. Way beyond my pay grade as a CMO guy, but it's something we all need to pay attention to. There's a war going on. That is impacting everybody's supply chains. You all see the impact of that much more than I do. I'm just going to focus on the pharma cost beyond the human cost of all this, which is horrifying. The cost of inputs is going up. Oil's not making its way through the Strait of Hormuz, or is in very, very small portions. A lot of inputs that rely on oil and other products that move through the strait are also constrained. We've seen BASF and Evonik announce certain API costs going up, up, up. Merck in Germany announced at one of their earnings announcements, they were seeing a lot of stocking up by customers who are expecting ingredients to fall into shortage or for cost to go up significantly. We're going to skip that because I only have 8 minutes left, and I get to talk about the FDA, and this is where I'm really concerned about things. That is RFK, the Secretary of HHS, which oversees FDA. This is the FDA's org chart. This came out Monday in BioSecure, which you should all be subscribing to. This shows since last week when the FDA commissioner resigned under pressure and then a number of personnel left or walked the plank, how many vacancies there currently are at FDA, as well as how many acting directors there are as opposed to full-time appointed ongoing. Right now we have an acting FDA commissioner, acting chief of staff, acting heads of CDER and CBER, which oversee NDAs, BLAs, ANDAs, all our drug applications, as well as external affairs, which is important as far as policy goes, digital transformation, which was one of the FDA commissioner's big areas. That director, the CIO left, the AI chief is gone. No one knows what this is all going to mean, is what I'm sort of trying to get at. There's a huge upheaval at the top of FDA, which mirrors last year when I spoke here, and 3,500 people had just been fired from the ranks of FDA. So we're seeing a lot of opening up top. No one knows which policies from the past year plus instituted by the FDA commissioner are actually going to continue. There's a lot of things he tried pushing forward, like this national priority review voucher to review a drug in 1 to 2 months instead of the usual 10-month review cycle. A significant push into AI, that pre-check program. All those things, no one knows right now because the commissioner is gone. The acting commissioner comes from the food side of things, FDA being Food and Drug Administration or agency. He's a lawyer, not a scientist. The vibe is that this might lead to a pendulum swing back to career personnel having more say at FDA going forward under this administration, where some of the career staff had been overruled on key issues over the past year plus. I will say we negotiated the generic drug user fees from October through the end of March, but really we're still doing paperwork to finish it all up. During that time, CDER has had 4 directors and FDA has had 2 commissioners. That instability is not good for anyone. It's not good for drug companies in the R&D space. It is certainly not good for CDMOs who are relying on R&D to proceed at a predictable or reliable path and plan. So hoping to see where things settle and that the agency going forward is actually somewhat stable is a goal, but everything is in total upheaval right now. As I mentioned, last year they fired 3,500 people from FDA, offered early retirement, and moved other people to positions they maybe should not have been moved to. They are trying to rehire. The FDA commissioner, long before he was fired, mentioned that they were bringing aboard 1,000 scientists, and then a week or 2 ago announced 3,000 more scientists being brought in with the idea of somehow compensating for all the firings they did just a year ago. Now, the problem with this is one FTE does not equal another FTE. They lost a lot of people with really high-level institutional knowledge at the agency. And if they're bringing in new staff now, those people need training, they need experience, they need to understand how things work. If they're handed a sort of doctrinaire policy that may be more politics-driven than science-driven, that's going to be bad news for all of us. It'll be bad news on the R&D side, where we've seen some strange refusals to receive and other rejections of drug applications. We'll see it on the CMO side when it comes to the inspectorate having much shorter inspection training than they used to. Anecdotally, I don't know if this is true or not, but historically I'd always heard that inspectors need 18 months of training and inspections with a higher level inspector before they're allowed to do their own inspections. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard recently that's now 6 weeks of computer training and they are sent out into the field. So, yeah. So if some of you are starting to see more observations, more maybe that wouldn't have been picked up by another inspector, but this guy seemed to be wanting to check every single box. That might be a factor, that they're new and they want to make sure they're capturing everything. So headquarters then has to figure out which observations are no action indicated, voluntary, or official, what ultimately could lead to a warning letter or a delayed drug application because of inspections and facility review as part of a drug review. This sort of turnover and lack of training could be a real problem, and that's hitting all of us, CMOs and drug companies both. 2 minutes, geez. Okay, so user fee reauthorizations are my big thing. Every 5 years, the agreement between industry and FDA gets renegotiated. We sit in the generic drug one because that has a facility fee component and that hits CMO facilities directly. But prescription drug, biosimilars, and medical devices are all negotiating pretty much simultaneously or concurrently. FDA, as I said, tried to do a number of America First policies. Some of them did not work, other ones did. One of the things to keep in mind, and this is again part of the public minutes, it's known, so I'm not giving away negotiating position. Historically, the generic drug user fee amendments, or GDUFA, included something called a foreign differential for facility fees. Every non-US facility, either finished dosage form or API, paid $15,000, that's 1-5, $15,000 more than a US facility does. That's meant to recoup the cost of doing inspections outside the US. This time around, they wanted to make it larger. I was afraid they wanted to make it much larger. They wanted to make it $25,000 instead of $15,000. We all ran the numbers and accepted that figure going forward. So when this new user fee comes out, it begins October 1st of the following year after this. Foreign facilities will pay $25,000 more than domestic, but the way the math works, the fees won't climb too much. It will reduce US facility fees, which is part of the goal for this whole thing. 45 seconds, geez. Okay, so the whole thing about FDA and GDUFA and user fee negotiations is every proposal is tied to FTEs. This proposal means we need this many people. This GDUFA negotiation, unlike past ones, is resource neutral. FDA informed us of this partway through. Every proposal that's there has to be done with the existing FTE footprint. They cannot onboard new people. They can only hire to the level of the current user fee period. And they lost a lot of people last year, so they're still trying to backfill to get to GDUFA number 3 levels. When they reach that point, that's going to absorb all the new stuff they're adding for GDUFA 4, which means the user fees will not go up significantly. They'll just increase with inflation year upon year. They'll be affected by a couple of inputs, but there's not going to be a giant jump in user fees going forward. All right, I'm at 0, but you've heard some of these conclusion points already from the past panelists and from each other and from just observing what's going on around you. Uncertainty is number one. We're seeing more regionalization. We're seeing more attempts at getting transparency in supply chains from governments. We're seeing attempts at trying to backstop certain critical and essential medicines and what that's going to mean in terms of domestic, not just US, but EU and other regions. That's going to be an issue going forward in terms of who can stack what where. The regulatory caution thing I want to get at for everybody, I know it's past time, but if we can't rely on FDA to have a reliable pathway for drug reviews, not necessarily a yes every time, but a coherent yes or a complete response letter, that's going to be bad for everyone. If we see arbitrary decisions made by FDA in terms of which drugs get approved and don't get approved, or which get bumped, or which get refusal to file, that will impact investors' decision about the R&D space. That might make pharma less appealing than other sectors and technologies, and that can hurt patients, hurt the marketing authorization holders, hurt the CDMOs. So that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, and it's one of the things we all need to be on top of, making sure that you guys are advocated for, that you're all pushing, whether it's a CDMOs, authorization holders, consultants, that we're making sure the voice is heard and that FDA needs to be consistent in its rulings going forward and work well with others, which this administration has not shown a great strength for. Anyway, don't take anything at face value. Ask questions. If you see a weird tweet at 3 o'clock in the morning from a certain high-level executive, don't base your entire reality on that. Take a moment, take a breath, ask questions, ask me, ask other people in industry, because we're in a world right now where everything is immediate and instantaneous, and we need to be able to assess what's true, not true, and what's going to change 5 minutes from now. All right, I know I went long. I'm really sorry. Ask questions. I'll be here for the next day plus. Thank you for your time. Thank the CDMO Live guys. You put on a great show. Sorry to keep you long. Go get some lunch.